Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here and have the opportunity to present on predictive policing. My name is Oskar Gstrein, and I live currently in the university in the city center of Groningen, where a couple of minutes ago, as you might probably hear, street musicians started to play. So if you hear Hotel California in the background or something like that, that's the explanation. I don't know whether you can hear it or not, but maybe, yeah, we also have a soundtrack for the presentation today, it seems.
Don't worry, Oscar, it's fine, but it will be nice to hear. In the case, don't worry, it's fine.
Okay, so I would like to give you at the beginning a little bit of a background on where I get the material from for this presentation. So I'm a senior researcher of the Data Research Center of Campus Friesland, which is a faculty of the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And there we currently work on a research project which is called Cutting Crime Impact. And Cutting Crime Impact is an EU-funded Horizon 2020 research project which has the aim to develop toolkits for law enforcement agencies. And we work with several law enforcement agencies in different countries. And one of the toolkits that we develop is on predictive policing, but we will also develop at the same time over the next 2 years toolkits for other areas such as mitigating and measuring feelings of insecurity of citizens, crime prevention through urban design and planning, and also community policing. And as I mentioned, I'm a member of the Data Research Center of the Campus Friesland of the University of Groningen, and we in this project focus particularly on ethical, legal, and social issues of predictive policing. And we currently carried out, our law enforcement colleagues carried out a state-of-the-art review on predictive policing in Europe and among the law enforcement agencies that take part in this program. And we are now producing a document focusing on these legal, ethical, and social issues. And all of this will be made available through the website of the CCI project. So we'd love to hear also back from you participating today, if you could, and love to engage with you on the matter. So when we talk about predictive policing, something that often comes up in people's mind first is a movie from the year 2002. Many of you will know it maybe. It's called Minority Report, and in the movie, it's a Steven Spielberg movie, Tom Cruise plays a law enforcement agent, and he's in a special department, the pre-crime department, and this department also has three very special members. They're called the pre-cops. Those are three individuals with superpowers that can see future crime and then notify agents like Tom Cruise, which then can already prevent the crime before it is happening. And the title, but of course it's not so easy, because the title of the movie comes from the fact that sometimes two of the three see a crime, but one other of these pre-cops does not see the crime happening. And that is then the so-called Minority Report. And the movie has held up remarkably well over the years, and there are indeed some parallels to predictive policing, because when we focus on predictive policing and what it means or what it could be, then first of all we realize that there is no universal definition of what it is, but instead of very special capabilities of individuals, it is based on the collection and analysis of data. I try to highlight that here a little bit in this long definition about previous crimes. So usually historical crime data is used as the basis for a statistical prediction of whether individuals or specific areas will see criminal activity with increased probability. And that should help law enforcement agencies to actually intervene or to develop prevention strategies and tactics. Now, maybe a little bit on the historical background. By now, predictive policing is about 10 years old. So it started in Los Angeles in the United States around 2009. And the original idea was to use methods that were developed for the prevention or mitigation of earthquake scenarios, and use this approach that was, as I said, originally created to forecast earthquakes, also for crime. That was the original idea, whether this could happen or not. Now, usually there are three different types of crimes being addressed. The first one and the biggest group is certainly property crime. So that's burglaries, vehicle theft. There can be cars, or in the Netherlands, very important, bikes, or other sort of petty crime, or a crime which is sort of a typical crime in a certain area of a city, which is sometimes not seen to be very safe. The term petty crime for our project, Cutting Crime Impact, is very important because in Cutting Crime Impact, we talk about high impact petty crime, which is sort of a contradiction in itself. And we're still trying to find a better terminology to describe what petty crime is, because particularly these areas where a lot of burglaries are happening, they often have also other structural issues. So this is something where predictive policing is typically applied, but it can also be used for the prediction of violent crime and even for the prediction of which individuals might be involved in crime. And on this slide, you see that a very famous from 2013 from Perry image on what predictive policing does and can do. So you see on the top, it starts with the data collection. The data collection in itself is already a very important element because, as I said, typically it's based on historic crime data, but you can also augment it by the predictions by using other data. I will get to that a little bit later. And then this data is analyzed, prediction is created, which then influences how law enforcement agencies on the ground use their forces, how they plan with resources. That leads to a certain intervention with criminals potentially responding to it. Then there is a new environment in which we can gather data again, and then the whole sort of cycle starts again. So the goals that are typically associated with predictive policing is that there is a better use of resources, as you can see beneath. Then there is we can better intervene specifically relating to certain crimes, and we can address and identify specific locations. So this is sort of the promise that predictive policy comes with. If we have enough data, if we have a lot of data, then we can make better predictions, then we can work better, and then the obvious return would be that crime rates start to fall. How does this look like? There are, and this is important because the question is, when you have a lot of data, how do you actually work with it? How do you visualize it? And how can you read this? So typically, what you see here on this from left to right are three different examples of how to show the data, to visualize the data. The left one is from software that's called HunchLab from the United States, where you see that a particular probability of certain types of crimes is displayed. The middle one is from Precop, which is a software that was developed by the Bavarian police for some time. And on the right side, you see CAS, which is the Dutch system, which is the system that the Dutch National Police developed and uses. Now, all of these three have in common that they use the grid mapping approach. So what you have is sort of a map of a city, and in this, the city is divided in a grid. For example, for the car system, that's 125 meters per 125 meters square, and then you identify within those grid those areas which, according to the data, deserve most of the attention. This is the most popular approach, but it should also be kept in mind that there are other approaches which, as you can see on the left, use, for example, ellipses. So the territory as such is not so important, but more where does the crime occur. And on the right side, you see this sort of data analysis visualization, which uses this valley and mountains approach. And it's important to keep in mind that there are these different opportunities for visualization, because that also allows you to read this sort of data structures differently. And that then can have an influence on how law enforcement agencies work with this. What's important to remember, and what I wanted to address, is that the basis of this data analysis, and especially the suggestions that these systems make, is automated individual decision making. You will know the terms probably because they're very popular right now: artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's maybe useful to know that both of these terms do not have clear definitions, universal divisions. Sometimes the terms are being used in a similar pseudonymous matter, and that's important to know because what actually happens to analyze the data is that an algorithm, so a machine decision-making structure, is being fed with the historical police data, and then based on this data creates predictions. And it's relatively unclear without specific technical knowledge how this sort of decision tree in the end works. And this creates some challenges that I will come to later in relation to law enforcement agencies themselves, which have a hard time understanding sometimes how these decision trees work, and also with the public that has a hard time understanding how law enforcement uses predictive policing tools. But further explaining the automated individual decision making, so this algorithm is fed with historical police data, and then it makes creates those predictions that are then visualized as we just discussed. And it's also interesting that the historical police data can be merged with other data sources. So, for example, you can use weather data, or you can use certain maps of the traffic network that you have. So it's an area, for example, very close to a highway, so it's very easy for burglars, for example, to get away. Or you can use income statistics of certain areas to also predict the likelihood of crimes. And all this affects the choices that you make, the assumptions and the choices that you make in the end. And the algorithm, of course, adjusts over time. So all of this is important to keep in mind, that this is sort of a living system that from the moment it is being deployed starts to interact with the environment. And this is one of the key characteristics of these sort of systems. Now, who develops predictive policing tools? We can see three different sort of categories. So you can buy finished solutions, and that's what, according to our data, most law enforcement agencies do at the moment. But this comes with two very important questions. So the first one is, do these law enforcement agencies understand how the software works? And equally important, how do corporations use the raw data that is provided to them through the law enforcement agencies? Do they create, when using the software, their own data pools from different users that they might have in different countries? So the whole sort of data policy around this is very important and very sensitive. And what happens with the insights at the end of the day? Because in other areas where this automated decision making is already being used, and where we see the training of algorithms in these sort of public-private partnerships, there are cases where large corporations use public data to train their algorithms, and once the system is, so to speak, mature, the cooperation stops, and then the corporations keep using the knowledge. So these are issues to be aware of and to take into account. But there are also two other models. There is a many law enforcement agencies opt for a collaboration with research institutions or with corporations, so they don't buy a finished solution but develop it together with the corporation. And some law enforcement agencies build their own solutions, and I've mentioned here two examples. So the CAST, the Dutch system, which is in development since 2013, and PreMap is a system that's currently still under development in Lower Saxony in Germany. And I mentioned these two examples because they are also part in the Cutting Crime Impact Research Project. So that is also where we get a lot of data from, and where we have the opportunity to exchange with colleagues from the law enforcement spectrum, which then feeds in what you see here. And that brings me to presenting a couple of selected ethical, legal, and social issues that we see and that we discuss in the context of the project. So I'd like to start with the ethical issues that we see. And those of you who follow the discussion about algorithms and artificial intelligence and machine learning, they will already heard of the challenge with data selection and potentially inherent machine bias when it comes to the development of the systems. And there, this is still something which we as a society work on understanding. And predictive policing is a clear application where that can play a role. Because, as I said, the fundamental basis for training those systems is historical crime data. Now, the data as such, if it's accurate, is what it is, but it only tells you so much. So it does not tell you what is behind the crime, or what is causing the crime, or which kind of factors are causing the crime. And then there is the danger that either already in this data, there is hidden, so to speak, without being explicitly there, but implicitly there, prejudice in a police force or in a public system that was socially tolerated during a certain amount of time. But as society moves on, the system of value changes, and how should this be reflected in an automated decision tree, which is based on historic police data. This is one of the big topics that we have anyways in this whole discussion about machine learning and algorithms. How can we not only train these systems by using what has been there in the past, how can we also implement social goals, social values in the development of these systems? Then the second issue that is very important to consider from an ethical point of view is, as I already pointed out, visualization and also interpretation of forecasts. This is something that is very important. Can those people who work, the agents who really work with the data, can they read it? Can they interpret it? This is something also where we need to build more experience just what data means and what data should mean. Another issue that's very important certainly is transparency and accountability. So it's also linked to understanding the data and sort of the pillars of the system, but also sharing with society as much as possible and as little so not everything can be transparent, of course, but the question is here, how transparent can you be that society trusts the process and trusts the system? Is it also clear, for example, when a corporate solution is being bought, who is accountable for what? All of these issues play a large role. Then another very big issue here is time and effectiveness. So when it comes to time, criminals will, of course, also adapt to the use of this system once it has been used for some time. So do we have effects like crime just moving from one area to the other? Or how will this system actually shape criminal behavior in the future? And the second point, effectiveness, it is very difficult to say from the data that we have whether predictive policing is an effective tool or not. So when you think you use predictive policing to reduce crime rates, there is, so far from all the data that we have seen and all from the research we have carried out, there is no empirical evidence that predictive policing as such is reducing crime rates. Crime as a phenomenon is too complex to just display it with this sort of tool. So there are other very positive effects or potentially positive effects of using predictive policing, but using the crime rate as such as an indicator is something that has empirically not been proven as a success for predictive policing. And then there is one final risk involved that should be mitigated, and that is the stigmatization of certain environments on the basis of data. So usually we all live in environments where we know there are safer and less safe areas, and that's true, of course. But the problem is that when this sort of judgments or prejudices most of the time are backed up with data, then the people living in those areas might ultimately find themselves in a situation where the social divide is growing even bigger. So this is something that we need to keep in mind, especially if, as it is the case sometimes in the United States, crime data and that the forecasts of such are in some form at the end of the day widely available to the public. So all of these issues need to be kept in mind, and they offer both, I want to emphasize this, they offer both opportunities, but also challenges. And this brings me to the next point where I would like to use the banner that you seen for this webinar, because I thought it's very interesting to take it as an example how we work or how we perceive data in the law enforcement context. So of course the new thing is using data, and this makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of promises, but it also bears the danger that we focus too much on the system and too much on the data and not enough on what it is about at the end of the day, which is creating a safe environment, which is fighting crime. So it's not treating the system, but treating solving the task in the end. And this is one thing that can be easily forgotten when using such innovative methods, that we focus too much on the tool and too little on the task. When we look to the legal domain, predictive policing, in a sense, when it comes to the automated processing of personal data, is covered by EU Directive 2016-680, which is sort of the sibling of the General Data Protection Regulation. And then there is one, specifically one provision, which is worth discussing, and that's Article 11 of the directive. And that's the right to review of those individual automated decisions. Because Article 11 says, in a nutshell, that an individual at least has the right to a human review of an individual automated decision. But we have a problem there, because first of all, there is still ongoing academic debate what this provision means in detail and how such a human review, for example, should look like in detail. And another challenge is that this is the right of the individual, but when we look at predictive policing, that's a big data application. So that's an application where there is a lot of data and different kind of data being used to make predictions, which could affect an individual, but typically affects a community. So Article 11 as an individual right, and the way our legal system is shaped as such, is currently not directly addressing this sort of issue. So the question that comes from the academic discourse and the discussion in that sense then is, should communities have a right to review decisions of law enforcement agencies? Yes or no? Remaining neutral on this, this is a question which is out there. There is discussion about group privacy, because also, for example, when you consider that you put out an advertisement on a social network like Facebook or Instagram, you can create groups where the people who the advert is then targeting at the end are not even aware of that they are the target. So how do we sort of mitigate these kind of risks? And also for the communities whose livelihood will be affected in somehow, is there a need to interact with them? But this is a broader story that we see from research with predictive policing. Also, so I had the chance to talk with a police officer who ran a pilot here in the city where I live, in Groningen in the Netherlands, with this Dutch national system. And what was very interesting here to see, also it was a success here, but at the same time where they used the system, they also used the insight that they got from the data to reach out to the community, to at the same time take specific actions with the people living in those areas to improve the overall situation. But I will come back to this in the end. Then finally, the social issues, everything is connected, right? So we already discussed this to a certain extent. So the big question is, how does this tool help to create trust with the community? It can create trust because, of course, law enforcement agencies can better justify why they are present, for example, in certain parts of the community at certain times. But certainly the culture around data is crucial. And this is something that we also see now in the United States, particularly in Los Angeles, where, as I said at the beginning, this whole development started about 10 years ago, that people are now, the general public is watching much more closely which kind of data is being used to make predictions, how is it being merged, and how are law enforcement agencies using this in their practice. Now, I think we have a bit of an advantage in Europe and specifically in the EU in that sense, because we have stricter legislation and a stronger regulatory framework when it comes to the use of data. That certainly helps, but still we have this sort of issue. How do we avoid machine bias? How can we make sure that this is really used for good? Then another question that I already raised, so how transparent can law enforcement agencies be around this? A couple of weeks ago, at the Data Research Center, Campus Riesa, I gave a presentation on predictive policing to my colleagues. And that was, of those colleagues who were not directly working in this field, they were asking this question, first of all. So do people know that law enforcement agencies use these kind of tools? Should people know? Some say, yes, of course, people should know. Others said it's probably, yeah, it's not something where you can be too transparent about. So this is certainly something where law enforcement agencies need to have a good strategy how to address this point. And then finally, the most obvious reason to use predictive policing is to reduce crime rates. But again, from at least empirical evidence that we see on this, and there are a couple of investigations into this, there is no proof that it works to drop crime rates to this point. It's also, it would be preliminary to say it is useless to drop crime rates, I think, because it's still a tool under development. It's still a developing technology, but at the same time, it would be wrong to promise too much, so to speak. This brings me to the conclusion. So the first point I already stressed, whether it is successful, useful is still open. I personally believe it is very important for law enforcement agencies to have a clear discussion at the start when developing this tool or using this tool to come up with clear success factors. And from what we see so far in cutting crime impact in the research project, we sort of start to develop a consensus around saying that the biggest gains are for internal management reasons. So when using data, law enforcement agencies start to understand better how they work, and they can potentially manage resources better. Although I have a bit of a problem with making the efficiency argument in the law enforcement context, because often using technology or more technology and efficiency together mean using less agents on the ground. And I think, this is my personal opinion, that this never works. So you cannot replace people actually working on the subject by any kind of technology, because in the end, it's about fighting crime, and crime is complex. We cannot, with the kind of methods that we have right now, we cannot just say we make a data analysis and then we know everything about what is going on there. It's much more complex. But what predictive policing certainly enables is to look differently at crime. So it's another interface to address this issue. And one thing that certainly should not be underestimated is that with new technology comes new inspiration on how to do things. There is a new set of incentives to work on it, and I think all of these can be positive outcomes of using predictive policing. So with this, I'd like to thank for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.